Now, among these musicians who are alumni of our band, have you noticed, are any of those guys like mad at us?
I better not say that. There are definitely some people mad at you, but I'm not going to say anything about that.
Well, maybe without naming the individuals involved.
Yeah, there were people that came in, used to wonder why people used to play back then with big 10-gallon cowboy hats. And it's because
they pass them around.
Love to scrap, she'll never say no. Shine up the battle apple, shake 'em all down tonight. Gonna mix in the street.
When you think of Donald Fagen, the brainy, sardonic half of Steely Dan, you imagine him behind a keyboard with a cigarette dangling and a sneer hidden somewhere between his lyrics. You don't often imagine him as a man sitting by the phone, waiting for Bob Dylan to call. But that is exactly how one of the strangest little footnotes in music history unfolded, and it left a bruise on Fagen's pride that he's never quite healed from. Back in 1981, Dylan was at one of his many turning points. He had been through the gospel years, endured a flurry of critical backlash, and was gearing up for another tour. True to his restless, unpredictable nature, he didn't want polished session players. He didn't want a slick band that had already been broken in by the system. No, Dylan placed an ad in a Los Angeles newspaper, small, almost unnoticeable, calling for qualified but unknown musicians to join him on the road. It was the sort of move that only Dylan could get away with. A living legend trying to find his band through the classifieds, like a garage rocker still piecing together a high school combo. Among the pile of responses, one stood out. Donald Fagen, yes, that Donald Fagen, had reached out. Steely Dan was on a hiatus after the release of Gaucho. Fagen was drifting in a lull, and perhaps on a whim, he thought, why not see what Dylan's up to?
You know, they thought that young people had an idea of how they might be able to cash in on it at some time, so they were just sort of letting them do what they want. Lasted for a few years, and we kind of snuck in there, so...
Rob Stoner, Dylan's bass player, recognized the name and excitedly told Fagen he'd personally put the CV in front of Dylan. For a man who had already conquered FM radio with Steely Dan's jazz rock labyrinths, the idea of playing sideman to the poet laureate of rock was more curiosity than desperation. Still, Fagen waited and waited and waited some more. The call never came. Dylan never followed up. For Fagen, that silence became its own sort of insult. As he later put it, Dylan passed up a good thing. Sorry, Bob, I'm not available anymore. I'm too busy. The irony, of course, was that he wasn't too busy. Steely Dan was inactive, and Fagen himself admitted it was a whim. But when the biggest songwriter of the 20th century ghosts you, there are only two ways to spin it: laugh it off or nurse the wound. Fagen, with his famously acerbic tongue, leaned toward the latter. The rejection stung all the more because on paper, Fagen should have been a perfect fit. Dylan thrives in looseness, a jazzy kind of swing where songs can wander into new shapes from night to night. And Fagen, though meticulous in the studio, had cut his teeth in improvisational jazz-inflected arrangements. Surely there was common ground. But Dylan is Dylan. He doesn't want players who overthink, who demand exactitude, who line up 7 guitarists to get the perfect solo the way Steely Dan did for Peg. He wants musicians who can follow his wandering spirit even if it means derailing a song mid-verse. And derail he does. Just ask the Rolling Stones. In 1995, Dylan shared the stage with them in Montpellier, France. Chris Robinson of the Black Crowes watched from the side as Dylan flubbed his cue, decided he didn't feel like catching up, and walked straight off the stage after delivering half a line.
It was Black Crowes, Bob Dylan, and the Rolling Stones.
Unbelievable.
And it was the best. I will always remember because I met Bob that day, and he's my, ultimately my biggest hero. Bob comes walking right beside me and Rich, and he's wearing the exact same outfit. He like saw what Mick, and I was like, that's fucking amazing. He walks out on stage.
Right.
They're playing a Bob Dylan song. Bob's sitting in. The Stones don't jam. They don't deviate. And then they come up to Bob's turn. So the band makes up, dun, 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 1, 2, 3, 4. And Bob goes to the mic and doesn't sing anything. Leans into the mic, turns away. I'm like, oh my God, what the fuck? It goes on for another half a verse. And they don't finish. We're standing there, and like Mick and Keith, like they go like he walks off before the end of the song. They're like, Bob Dylan, and he turns around and he looks at them and he goes, fuck you, like this. And he gives him the finger. And like, I'm like, it's the best fucking concert I've ever seen in my life. It's incredible. And Keith, I can see Keith goes, oh, don't be like that, Bob.
Keith Richards begged him not to be like that. Dylan flipped him the bird and vanished. That's Dylan, mercurial, uncompromising, demanding not just musicianship, but a total surrender to his erratic flow. It's not hard to see why Fagen's Audition by Letter never got traction. But Fagen has never quite been able to let it go. Over the years, he's lobbed little barbs at Dylan with the same sly venom he puts into his lyrics. In 2013, he dismissed Dylan's work as a dozen minor key drone tunes with 3 chords, even daring to say Dylan had written songs more boring than some early Appalachian songs. He mocked the endless verses, the lack of melody, and twisted the knife by suggesting Dylan needed a psychiatrist more than a throat doctor. It was a brutal assessment, one that sounded less like professional criticism and more like an old grudge being aired out. And yet, the irony is rich. Steely Dan themselves had borrowed from Dylan. The title of their first album, Can't Buy a Thrill, came straight from Dylan's 1965 track, It Takes a Lot to Laugh, It Takes a Train to Cry. Dylan's DNA was in the Dan from day one, whether Fagen wanted to admit it or not. Perhaps that makes the rejection cut deeper, like being denied by someone you'd already honored in your own work. To be fair, Fagen's feelings toward Dylan have always been more complicated than pure bitterness. He swings between scorn and admiration, a kind of ambivalence that reveals the truth. Dylan mattered to him. In 2016, he softened his tone, praising Dylan for ignoring the Nobel Prize, calling him an artist who transcended the institutions trying to honor him. He even quoted Jack Nicholson to remind people that Dylan will always be the greatest living songwriter. And when asked directly, he insisted, just say, we love him. He's Bob Dylan. We talk about him all the time. But beneath the diplomatic words, there lingers that old rejection. Dylan never called back. Dylan never gave him the chance. And for a perfectionist like Fagen, who spent his life chasing flawless arrangements and surgical precision in the studio, Dylan's dismissal was a reminder that not everyone wanted perfection. Some just wanted chaos. Would it even have worked? Probably not. Dylan's band thrives on loose, shape-shifting energy, while Steely Dan thrives on control. Dylan's shows can dissolve into half-finished verses and impromptu detours, while Fagen and Walter Becker once auditioned 7 different guitarists just to nail the peg solo exactly as they heard it in their heads. It's hard to imagine Fagen's tightly wound artistry surviving Dylan's "you go your way, I'll go mine" stage ethos. Still, it's the not knowing that gnaws at him. Fagen wanted to see what might have happened if the brainiest band in rock had collided with the freest spirit in music. Instead, he got silence, and decades later, he's still talking about it. Sometimes with bile, sometimes with begrudging respect, but never with closure. It's almost poetic in a way. Dylan has always been the trickster, the vagabond who leaves others unsettled, the artist who never gives you what you expect. Donald Fagen, the craftsman of immaculate jazz rock, got a taste of that chaos firsthand, and he's never forgiven him for it, because sometimes the wound isn't in what was said, but in what wasn't. Dylan never said no, he just never said anything at all, and for a man like Donald Fagen, that silence might be the cruelest rejection of all.